Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thanks for being here. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today's live Q&A topic is requirements and challenges of plain language content creation for multiple audiences. We're proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory service companies. If you have urgent project needs or are looking for more guidance regarding your plain language deliverables, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us for a free 30-minute consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. Our first presenter today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Also joining us today is Stacy Beecham, Regulatory Affairs Consultant with Criterion Edge. Stacy has a BS in Biology and a MS in Human Physiology with extensive experience in regulatory writing and 10 years of experience in international regulatory affairs. Stacy was a medical researcher prior to entering the regulatory space where she worked with physicians and scientists at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Stacy's expertise in regulatory affairs, submission writing, clinical research, and regulatory consulting for medical device, biopharma, and biotech makes her a valuable asset to our team. Welcome, Stacy and Lori. Now I will turn it over to you, Lori, to give an overview of how our session will run today.
Thank you, Olivia, and hello, everyone. Today is going to be a 45-minute live Q&A. We received so many great questions at registration. We'll get started on those as you're gathering your thoughts and maybe additional questions that you would like to submit in our Q&A screen, and we'll try to get to those today as well. We're going to be answering your questions regarding key aspects that define plain language writing, many questions about that, and the regulatory and legal requirements of plain language content. That's a Stacy. Stacy loves those kinds of questions, and she will be happy to answer those today. And then probably most especially, we'll be trying to work on coming up with solutions to your common pain points. For example, this is a question we get a lot. How do we standardize key messages or messaging across multiple written deliverables and platforms? And we'll talk about that. And that's just one example of common pain points. So without further ado, Olivia, let's move to our questions.
All right, our first question today is from Monica. She is asking, how does plain language writing differ for HCPs versus a lay audience?
Well, Stacy, I can take that one.
Okay, great.
Yeah, there are differences. It is different, but it depends on, and you'll hear us talk about this. I wish I could give you a straightforward answer, but it depends is the answer. It depends on what the goal is of the plain language writing that you might be sending to the HCP. What is your goal? Always first ask yourself the question, what do I want this plain language content messaging to accomplish? In other words, what's its goal? So if you're sending something to an HCP, for example, do you want to send plain language content or information to the HCP so that they can perhaps more easily explain complex concepts or results from a clinical trial, for example? that they can more easily explain it in plain language to their patients? Is that your goal? Or is your goal something different? So that's what I mean by what is the goal? Do you want them? Are they the only intended audience and you want to summarize a rather complex published article, even summarize it in easier language than the abstract that would be published with that article? Then I would say that the bar for plain language requirements, if you're only speaking to the HCP and you just want them to know what they need to know, then your plain language bar is a little different. For example, in my last webinar that I gave a couple of weeks ago, there was a study done. I presented some high-level information from a study that was done on how do HCPs like to receive their information. Is it in a standard response document, an SRD? Is it text only? Is it a combination of text and infographics, questions and answers? How do they like to read plain language meant only for them? So I would suggest that you could look back on that webinar that's posted on our website and see how they like to be spoken to if you're only speaking to them. If you are, and obviously if you're sending this plain language to a lay audience, who is that audience? Who are you talking to? Are you talking to the patient? Are you talking to a caregiver or parent? So these are all the multiple considerations to take into when you're designing plain language content and those deliverables.
All right, thanks, Lori. Moving on to our next question from Brenda. What ratio of graphics and pictures to text is most successful when writing for the layman? And Stacy, maybe do you want to take this one?
And
Sure.
and I just referenced that myself, didn't I, Stacy?
Yes, you did.
So there's actually it matters. So Stacy, yes, please go ahead. It really does matter.
Yes, and as Lori said, it really depends on who your audience is and what you're trying to accomplish with your messaging. But one example we had discussed when gathering tools to share with you after the webinar, Olivia is going to send you a bunch of links to examples for different audiences and what type of terminology and what type of wording and infographics can be used. But we were discussing what to do when the treatment is intended for a child and how you explain the procedure to a child versus how you explain it to their parent or caregiver, for example, versus how you then again explain it to an HCP. And I think that, you know, we all understand that infographics and symbols are universal language and that colors matter and white space matters. And the way that these processes, procedures, and different warnings and risks are portrayed is really important for the understanding of the patient and the caregivers and the HCPs. And Olivia is going to pop up, I think, at the CDC one, Olivia, the CDC examples. The CDC here in the US had a contest for around health literacy for public health purposes, but also for recruitment for clinical trials. And they showed a variety of examples of infographics that you can use for different purposes. And they explain in some instances why different infographic to text ratios are more effective depending on which audience you're targeting. So I think to look at those examples is a good start.
And in the webinar that, Stacy, I would add too, that in the webinar that I presented last time, I alluded to it just now, is that there was I ran across and became aware of a study that another company had done about how to, what are the preferred methods of HCPs receiving their information versus patients receiving their information, and what do HCPs prefer. And that sort of kind of blew apart some of the myths that we think that HCPs wanted only in text is just fine with them. They actually liked a mix of text, infographics, and links. They liked to be able to link to things, like the original source material. Whereas with patients and or caregivers, they weren't as interested in the links as part of the deliverable. So check out the webinar from the slides from the webinar from last time for more information on that.
I don't know about you guys, but I love graphs and charts and flow charts and diagrams. I just think it's a nice, easy way to get the general concept quickly, and then you can dive in to the details if you want to. But I think it's a universal language that everyone has really come to accept.
Definitely. Thanks, Stacy.
I would actually push back on that a little bit, because we're all scientists. And yes, for us, absolutely. And for educated, I think people, yes. But we have to be careful, is that there are people whose English is not their first language, or they have learning or reading disabilities or challenges. So sometimes graphs and text and graphics can be overwhelming to them.
That's true too.
This is why this is such a tough topic.
Mhm.
And where do you find the balance? Or since many of you on this call are from industry, or do you create multiple versions of the same thing, 2 or 3 different kinds of versions? One is an infographic, with charts, graphs, others with links and a balance of text and some simple infographics. So consider that there isn't a one size fits all audience members for your pieces of plain language writing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to our next question. There's 2 questions that I'm going to put up here on your screen. I think they go hand in hand. The first one, if the device is for healthcare practitioners, should the SSCP be for the HCP or general public audience? And then with that, is there any specific vocabulary that you should use for lay audience materials versus HCPs?
So I'll take that, Stacy.
Sure.
With regards, certainly Criterion Edge, we have written many plain language summaries, and in no small number, those are the patient sections of SSCPs when they are required. Not all medical devices require a plain language section to the SSCP that's patient level. So if the device is for an HCP, should the SSCP be for the HCP or general public audience? Okay, so that I take that to mean that if the device is meant only for the HCP, it's something they're handling. For example, should the SSCP be for the HCP or the general public audience? I would check regulations for that, and maybe Stacy, you've got some additional insights with this, but it should be written, in my opinion, for the and our practice is for the general public, because this is a searchable, this information, the SSCPs, it goes out onto a searchable database, and the HCP doesn't really need plain language to understand how he or she handles the device. The patient needs to understand what the device is for. So Stacy, do you have any further comments on that?
Sure. Yes, I think I would agree with you. In fact, even when we're dealing with competent authorities and notified bodies, to a certain extent, we make the language a little more generic, I guess, than we would for a cardiac physician who handles these types of things every day, right? But if it's meant for, let's say, someone who works in a cath lab, it's a coronary catheter, let's say that, and the SSCP would be geared toward the healthcare practitioner, but who's reviewing this? Who's reviewing your SSCP? Who's looking at that? And so, I mean, really, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's not whose eyes are going to be on this and who's going to be evaluating it. Well, they're using an evaluation tool, and we'll put this in the links too. There's guidance, MDCG guidance in Europe around how notified bodies should evaluate the SSCP, and that guidance speaks to the lay language, the general approach to these SSCPs, and they are validating it based on that criteria. Right. So they're not evaluating it based on this is going to a cath lab, so it needs to be specific to a cath lab HCP. That's not how they're evaluating your SSCP.
Right. So this is for the devices that do require a plain language summary, that in our interpretation and having submitted dozens, if not hundreds of these, the notified body doesn't push back on the level that we use for the patient section of the SSCP, which is lay language, usually at around the 7th or 8th grade level. And but again, align with that within your own company on what it is that, what level of language that you want to aim for. But in general, has always been interpreted by us and our clients that it is aimed for the general public, general public audience, I suppose, at that level, and certainly patients who are interested in whatever that device is they either need to interact with or is being implanted in their body. So I would aim for that. And then the second question, what is specific vocabulary for lay audience materials versus HCP ones? I think we've had a few questions on this. We may even get more on this. So I would linger on this only to say, remember your audience and who you're speaking to, and is there specific vocabulary for lay audience materials? Not specific vocabulary, although Stacy, you did run across, I think, a handy tool. Why don't you talk more about that?
Sure. In the UK, they kicked off last year a plain English campaign, the MHRA regulatory body over there. And they have a committee on safety of medicines, and they have this working group. They put together a glossary of lay language terminology or lay language descriptions, I guess, that correspond to medical terminology. And Olivia will pop it in the chat here for you. To see an example, but it's worth digging into. They have done a lot of work around this on how we can make the messaging more digestible for a variety of audiences. And, obviously in Europe, you have a lot of languages present within a close proximity. So we have a lot of second language speakers living in different countries, countries with varying first languages. And even though English is the recognized basis for SSCPs, that's what the notified bodies validate is the English version of the SSCP, and then it can go off for translation. So we know that English is kind of the basic language that they're requesting, but we know that our audience aren't necessarily native English speakers. So what do we do with that? Well, there is guidance around that. And there's now a glossary. And I think it's fabulous that we have such a tool. So Olivia has sent that.
Yeah, I would take it even a step further for all of you in the audience is to start with a tool like this. Why recreate the wheel?
Yes.
I think is what Stacy, yes, right, Stacy. But you're all going to have, and that's a great start for an internal glossary tool or messaging tool. And I believe this is best practice for a company to begin to build your plain language glossary of your common terms. Obviously, if you are a company, an orthopedic company that makes hip implants, you don't need to come up with plain language describing a cardiac stent. So make your own glossary, excuse me, of terms and or very short explanations. If you know, not just individual words, but how would you describe X? You know, a short explanation of the doctor will do this before they implant something into your body. How would you describe what the doctor will do? Short burst glossaries that you've all agreed upon across your cross-functional groups, and start building your own dictionary, if you will. Great questions.
Yes, if I could add just one
Mhm.
comment for the related to the first question there. The SSCP is really only required for class 3 and implantable devices and some
Mhm.
other exception devices. However, the lay summary within the SSCP. However, what they're realizing is the lay summary is beneficial for several different purposes, not only for patients and HCPs, but also for researchers, for recruitment, for recruiting for clinical trials, for investing in clinical trials, for grant purposes. So it's not a bad idea to have a lay summary available. That's kind of universal that you could use within your submissions or within your SSCP for even a class 2 device, for example. It's not a bad idea to just generate that up front, because I think that there will be several ways that you'll use that. And if you have kind of your language worked out as to what's the lay description for the medical terminology that you'll be using related to that device, initially kind of build your own glossary, like Lori said, internally for that device or that device family or that group of medicines. I think that's a really beneficial tool to have in your back pocket, or beneficial material.
And I would add one last thing, which is as the demand and requirements for plain language material grows, certainly in medical affairs, medcom, on the commercial side of things, and in the clinical development side of things, even beyond that, but even in clinical science and, you know, IVD companies, all of this is that this is going to become a major, it's already becoming major initiatives. So get your glossary, get your templates, get people on board, try to streamline this as much as possible, because the volume of this writing is quickly growing to such a degree that our clients are reaching out more and more to us to ask us to do this kind of writing. You may not have enough bandwidth or expertise within your own company to be able to keep up. And so having these tools already defined is great for either your internal team, if you're using an internal team to do the writing, or as references for an external vendor partner who needs to work with you, an agency or a writing company such as ourselves. Get these tools in place so that we're all on the same page, whoever's writing it and whatever the messaging is. Next question.
All right. While we're on the topic of SSCP submissions, Kimberly is asking, do you provide readability assessments with SSCP submissions proactively?
The short and quick answer to that is yes, if our clients ask us, which is usually yes, but they don't always. So that's now that's us, because we do not interact with the notified body. So what we don't know really, and we've never really asked, is it submitted to the notified body, the SSCP, along with the documents with a readability assessment. Stacy, do you have any knowledge of that?
I actually do. I just went through this about 10 months ago, and they did ask for documentation of
Who's they? Who's they?
Sorry,
The notified
the
body?
notified body. Yes, yes. Sorry
Okay.
about that. The notified body did ask for the first time ever in my experience and in the experience of anyone I was working with on this project, no one had ever heard of that, but they did for the first time ever that we know of, in our experience, ask for what readability, what validated assessment tools were used to assess the readability of the lay summary for your SSCP. And we did list them, and we did further ask them, what do you expect to see here? And they said, no, we do not need the results of your assessment. We just need documentation that you used more than one validated assessment tool. So that leads us to another grouping of questions, I think, Olivia, that everyone has been asking. What type of tools should we be using to assess the readability level of, our materials, right? And of course, there are 7 very common assessment tools, but there are others available and others being developed that are more specific to certain groups of medicines and devices. So it's good to keep apprised of what type of tools are out there specific to the audience that you're targeting. But either way, we will pop in the chat a list of the 7 most common readability assessment tools, just so that you have a starting place.
So I want to add to Stacy's comments, since we're talking about readability. There's another word that we haven't mentioned yet. It's called suitability. So there's readability and suitability, which in other words, how well is the content, is it suitable to the audience? Will they be able to understand it, not just from a readability standpoint? This gets more into how is it formatted? Does it answer their questions? Or is it not related? That's the suitability of it. And that has to do with style, language, prose, graphic design, all of these types of things. So this is, we're talking about readability as if that's the only bar and measure, and it's not. There's a suitability. And the other thing I want to say is about these tools is that there are also other tools out there, readable, I believe, .com, where for a small fee, you can subscribe to and then run your content through a company like that. What do they use? They use multiple. So they use multiple types of, I'm sure not proprietary, but they use multiple tests. And then the way they mix it together and apply it, of course, is proprietary to them, and out comes their assessment of the readability and suitability of any content you want to put in front of them. So you can look for companies that have kind of trying to solve this problem for you, or you can use 1 or 2 different standalone tests. And most of those standalone tests are commonly available. Even Word has the ability to test for readability. Mm-hmm. So you can use one tool, or you can use a combination of tools.
And Olivia will pop in the chat an example, a common example of a suitability assessment tool. They call it the SAM tool. Yeah. And there's a link to that. So, and then there's, of course, the Clear Communication Index, by which suitability and readability are kind of measured together to some extent. There again, like Lori said, there are several ways that you can assess that, but there are these are the common tools that people have been using for readability and suitability.
Great, thanks, Stacy. While we are on the topic of readability, we have a couple of more questions. Can you speak about the tools or tests to assess patient readability? And then also what tools that you use to assess for plain language and health literacy readability levels?
I don't know that with these 2 questions, we have much more to add than what the questions we just answered. So, but these questions are specific to patient readability, and what thresholds do you, I would like to focus on that question though. What thresholds should be used, maybe I'll just say that way, with these tools to assess readability? So what thresholds? I think the questioner is looking for, am I talking about 8th grade? Am I looking at high school? Am I looking at 4th grade? And let's loop back to some comments that we made earlier in this session, which is, who is your audience? What do they need to know? Who's reading this? And what's on their mind? The old thing about, how would you explain this to a tonsillectomy to your 7-year-old? Is the 7-year-old the one that's reading it, or is a caregiver? In other words, and also about, are there multiple tools that are multiple types of documents that you need to prepare? One for the 7-year-old who's getting the tonsillectomy, and one for their parent on what to know when your 7-year-old is getting a tonsillectomy. So there's different bars to pass. We always ask our clients, you tell us, where do you want to, we need that guidance from you. What grade level do you want us to write at? What type, do you use a readability assessment tool already? We'll use that, internally, because we'll be happy to use that. Let us know what it is you want us to do. And always be keeping in mind who's listening, who's it meant for, and what is the goal of it.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Moving on to our next question from Erica. She is asking, is it more efficient to have the technical author write the plain language summary, or more effective to use a separate author?
Well, there are 2 words in there, which is more efficient or which is more effective. And those two goals might not be aligned with each other. So I'm going to take the first part. The 2 words that jump out to me is like efficiency and technical author. So is it more efficient for a technical author to write a plain language summary? Do they even know what that is? So if a technical author has no knowledge of what plain language is, which is a very specific type of writing, then it is not at all more efficient to have someone who has no idea what plain language is to write it, just because they wrote the original non-plain language content. So it is not more efficient. It is more effective to use a separate author, and more common. I would say it's more common. I would say that most scientists / technical people, many of us on this call today are scientists. We come from clinical, we come from the bench, we come from all different places. It is our job, and we're trained to say things. It's reflexive in us to use our best words, our most precise words, because we're all talking the same language. I'm a registered nurse. I'm a critical care registered nurse. When I'm talking to my colleagues or the physicians I work with, we talk in our lingua franca, right? The language we understand to each other. I don't explain that to when I'm at the bedside and talking to a patient, an 80-year-old wife of a man, or the sister of somebody. So you have to let go of our precision, our need in our own language to be precise, because plain language writing isn't precise. It communicates broader themes. So Stacy, what do you think about that?
Sure. Yes. I'd just like to add one thing to that. We've had a couple of white papers, I know, and some blog posts at Criterion Edge that have spoken to the importance of cross-functional teams within your organization, the importance of regulatory speaking with technical writers, speaking with marketing, personnel to make sure that your claims are aligned and that your messaging is aligned and that everyone's understanding what everyone else is trying to say and that you're not saying anything inaccurate, but that you're getting the point across to the audiences, that the end audience, right? The target audience. And I think one thing I've learned more recently with a larger organization that I've done some consulting for is they bring in their marketing team. And of course, they have a sophisticated marketing team of many tiers of experience and expertise, but they bring in the marketing team to, create the claims for the product. And then they also use that marketing team to weigh in and or co-author their lay language, anything requiring lay language. And I think it's such a good idea because obviously the marketing team has a concept of what the product is intended to do. And it's just a nice cross-functional approach between the writing team and the marketing team to accomplish this end goal of an effective and hopefully efficient, but effective messaging.
Yeah, and the marketing team, that's their job, right? So great, pull them in to harness the power of people's expertise within your own organization and their points of view. So I think that's a great message, Stacy.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Moving on to our next question from Robin, and I think this is an interesting one, Lori. She's asking, what should I consider for documents that are translated into multiple languages?
I'm not sure what we mean by what I should consider. So what are the considerations? Let me rephrase it. And I hope this is what you mean, Robin. What would be the considerations of some plain language content, whatever that might be, and that is going to need to be translated by across multiple geographies in multiple languages? All right. So I would say that the plain language content needs to be as simply worded as possible and artfully worded as possible so that it could hold up to the challenges of it being translated into French versus Urdu, for example, that it's going to be read by people in this geography, South Africa to Yemen to Brussels to India to Singapore and all points in between. So those are the challenges I know that you're thinking about. Certainly a talented translation service should be able to translate the nuances of the plain language, original English version, plain language content into culturally specific and an appropriate language, and then somehow certify that, which I know that translation services do. That's the best that I could come up with. We write the plain language summaries or the plain language content, and then if it goes out for translation, that's something that we don't track. And for that matter, I'm not even sure how we would. How would you? One thing I would like to say is, like I was about to say, how would you prove it that somebody in Pakistan understands the intent that you wrote in English? I would say that translation services should also be able to offer you the feedback from lay people that speak that language. Like, do they understand it? And that takes me a little bit into, are you running your plain language content by your patients? Do they understand it? Let's just talk about English now for a moment. What do they think of your plain language content? Do they get what you're trying to tell them? Is the message received? So that's a big bar. And Stacy, I'd love to hear you weigh in on that. It's like, how are you ensuring even that your English speaking audience is fully grasping the message and the takeaways?
Yes, so there is this MDCG. I'm going to just making sure I'm getting the number right, 2019-9, that is, it was initially guidance that was geared for notified bodies evaluating SSCPs, but the recent rev in March of 2022 added manufacturers to that. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? It was geared toward notified bodies. Now this guidance is geared toward both notified bodies and manufacturers, because they want manufacturers to see what notified bodies are evaluating your SSCP on. So that is something that I would really digest if I were you, and try to figure out, what are they assessing this based on? What's their criteria? What's their rubric? And what do they expect to see? And they offer such great examples in there of the type of language and the type of description and the level of detail that they do expect to see in both the HCP portion of your SSCP and the patient portion. So I would just really, that's one of those things like the EUMDRs, you just have to read it over and over again and consult it like you would consult an encyclopedia. It's such a great guide to get you understanding, I guess, to gather understanding and to try to comprehend what the notified bodies are looking for and what makes sense to them and what they would expect the writing to look like for the lay audience.
Right. And then
yeah.
translate that out to, because again, notified bodies are only for medical devices. So you and IVD. So you translate that out to other forms of plain language that have no regulatory component to them whatsoever. They're not required by regulations, but they must adhere to regulations. Stacy's going to prick her ears up and say, yeah, but there better not be any new claims, which we all know very well. But I'd like to move on to our last question. Let's just try to wrap this up. I don't want to go over too much, but we have so many great questions. Do you have one more, Olivia?
Do we have time for one more?
Sure. If people can drop off if they want to, but let's take one more.
All right. So here's one more question from Tiffany. And she is asking, should plain language summaries be translated in each language where the clinical trial was performed? And do you have a template?
I can take this one.
Go for it.
There is a template. Excuse me.
For what, Stacy? A template?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
I was just
What
thinking,
are we
well,
talking
which
about?
template are we talking about here? You know what? The links will answer your questions, I guess, is the short answer. But there is a template for an SSCP. There's also a template for in Annex 5 of the clinical trial regulations, which is intended for pharma. It's intended for medicinal products. However, it's kind of known that the EU is using this as across the board as kind of a guidance for what they expect a summary of the results of the clinical trial for laypersons to look like. And it has 10 criteria, 10 main aspects that they expect to be included. So that's in the chat and you can consult that. But the long and the short of it is the notified body will validate the English translation or the English version of your lay summary if it's part of an SSCP. And you then go translate it into any languages required by the regulatory authority or the notified body to which you're going to present it.
So I would add that plain language summaries, if this is for a published article, so we haven't talked much about plain language summaries today, which are common to be published for any article that the company, in other words, it can be published simultaneously with the published article, and it's a plain language summary of that content. It can be published in the supplement section or the supplement of a major article. And we know that clients feel like that might not be the most effective place to publish plain language summaries. The most effective methodology to publish plain language summaries for published articles is to create that plain language summary as a separate document that has its own publication date, its own DOI.
Absolutely.
Yes, because of two words, because you want this to be accessible and understandable, this information to your accessible and discoverable to the lay audience. If a plain language summary is published as part of a supplement, then your patients are not going to be able to find it very easily, because a supplement just says supplement. They don't know what's inside that supplement. There could be a very valuable plain language summary, but they are not going to know it, and they might be discouraged from looking. It's not always feasible to publish and create a plain language summary simultaneous with the publication of a major article. We all know we've helped first authors write many major articles, and we all know that it's being changed up until the moment it needs to be submitted. So how are you going to do that and also submit a plain language summary at the same time? So it's more common that plain language summaries come along later, a month, 3 months, 6 months, even later, and they have their own DOI so that they are discoverable and accessible.
Yes, and I'll add to that, Lori, Olivia popped something in the chat. It's an article from PubMed that speaks exactly to what Lori was just mentioning. And it's talking about if you have a publication that speaks to clinical trial results, then how do you modify that so that it's understandable for patients and, for investors or for any general audience. Mm-hmm.
Yes, right. Well, we thank you all for hanging in there for this last question. We went just a few minutes over, but we so appreciate everyone's time and attention and engagement in this very important topic. Again, many of us are healthcare professionals, certainly as nurses, physicians, and so forth. And so our focus so much is on patients. Patients speak plain language. So this is, near and dear to many of our hearts to talk about this kind of content and how to get this very critical and valuable information into the right hands so that they can understand it. It's not, this important information is not just for healthcare providers anymore. We're in an industry that's not so top down that it used to be. It's and I like this new democratic approach to providing information. I think it's great. So we really appreciate you all coming and your interest in the topic. Stacy, any final thoughts on your end?
Not at all. Thanks, everyone. And just feel free to reach out if we can help.
Thank you again, Lori and Stacy, and everyone for joining us. Take care, and we hope to see you next time. Have a great day.